Hollywood doesn't announce when someone is being pushed out. It just goes quiet. And that silence can be louder than any headline. Because when power fades, the industry stops calling, stops booking, and stops pretending everything is fine. And right now, something feels off. Because a couple once everywhere is suddenly missing from places they used to dominate. And the reason matters, because this story is not about gossip. It is about court filings, industry signals, and a chain reaction that no one wants to talk about yet. And what happens next could change how Hollywood decides who stays protected and who doesn't. Hollywood rarely signals when the temperature changes. It just shifts. And suddenly, doors that were always open take longer to answer calls. Calls that once came instantly start going to voicemail, and faces that dominated every list quietly disappear without explanation. And that is exactly the kind of shift people have been sensing around Blake Lively and Ryan Reynolds. Not because of one headline or one rumor, but because of a pattern that has been forming in plain sight. And the most striking part is how subtle it is, because Hollywood never wants to be seen as turning its back. It simply redirects attention elsewhere and lets the absence do the talking. And that is why the recent IMDb feature on Hollywood power couples landed so hard. Not because inclusion equals validation, but because exclusion changes perception. And when 81 couples spanning decades, genres, and relevance make the list, and one of the most publicly branded couples of the last decade does not, it invites questions. And in this industry, questions travel faster than answers, and those questions begin connecting dots, whether fair or not, because timing matters. And this exclusion arrived as a high-profile legal dispute involving Blake Lively continues to unfold, drawing increasing scrutiny, not just from media, but from legal analysts, industry observers, and creators who specialize in reading between the lines. And what makes this moment compelling is that no one from the studios is issuing corrections. No spokesperson is calling it an oversight. No one is rushing to reassure investors or fans. And that silence suggests that the industry itself is waiting. And when Hollywood waits, it usually means risk assessment is happening behind closed doors. And risk assessment does not ask who is right. It asks what is safest. And that distinction explains a lot of what is happening now. Because safety in Hollywood is not about morality, it is about predictability. And when a narrative becomes unpredictable, the instinct is to pause, delay, and distance until clarity returns. And that is where the story begins to tighten, because clarity has not arrived. And instead, the legal filings have introduced more complexity rather than resolution. And that complexity is not emotional, it is structural, rooted in definitions, contracts, jurisdiction, and process. And those are the areas courts care about most, and the areas where cases often quietly rise or fall long before a jury ever hears a word. And according to publicly discussed filings, the Wayfarer parties have centered much of their response on foundational issues rather than dramatic rebuttals, focusing on employment status, contractual relationships, and the scope of applicable laws. And this approach signals a belief that the case may struggle to survive on procedural grounds alone. And that belief carries weight, because courts are not sympathetic to narratives that do not align with statutory frameworks. And one of the most discussed elements is the distinction between employee and independent contractor, because it determines which legal protections apply and which do not. And according to the defense filings, Blake Lively was compensated through an LLC, received a 1099, and was not classified as an employee. And that classification is not cosmetic, it is legal. And when someone is not an employee, claims tied to workplace environment statutes face higher hurdles. And this is not opinion, it is established legal structure. And that is why this argument matters, because it reframes the case away from emotional framing and into applicability. And once a case moves into that territory, public sympathy becomes less influential than legal precision. And this is where the narrative tension grows, because viewers sense that the courtroom is not reacting the way social media reacts, and that difference often shocks audiences who expect moral alignment to dictate outcomes. And instead, the filings suggest that much of the evidence being presented may not connect directly to the claims as pled. And relevance is everything in court. And relevance is not about how something feels, it is about whether it proves a specific legal element. And when filings begin challenging relevance, it signals a belief that the foundation is weak. And that belief appears again in discussions of timing and jurisdiction, because where and when alleged statements occurred matters, and courts are precise about geographical applicability and legal reach. And according to defense arguments, some of the statements being cited occurred outside the primary jurisdiction being used to anchor the claims, which introduces another layer of challenge. And each of these layers alone might not be fatal, but together they create friction, and friction slows momentum. And momentum matters, not just in court, but in public perception, because as momentum slows, attention shifts. And when attention shifts, Hollywood notices. And that brings us back to the industry response, which has not been overt, but has been noticeable in project timing and public visibility. And while studios often attribute delays to scheduling, market conditions, or strategic alignment, insiders know that these phrases often function as placeholders while decisions are being reevaluated. And reevaluation does not mean cancellation, it means waiting to see how a situation resolves. And that waiting period can be costly, because in Hollywood, relevance is currency, and time is not neutral. And while none of this proves intent or outcome, it explains behavior, and behavior is what audiences track. And what has kept viewers locked into this story is not a desire to see someone fall, but a fascination with watching how power recalibrates when legal complexity enters the spotlight. And as filings continue to surface, the tone remains measured, procedural, and deliberate, which contrasts sharply with the dramatic framing surrounding the case online. And that contrast itself becomes part of the story, because it highlights the gap between narrative momentum and legal momentum. And that gap is where outcomes are often decided, quietly. And the longer the case remains unresolved, the more that gap widens. And when gaps widen, speculation fills them. And speculation drives viewership, because people want to understand not just what is happening, but what it means. And that is why this story has not faded, despite the absence of explosive daily headlines, because the real developments are occurring in documents, not sound bites. And those documents suggest a battle not over truth versus falsehood, but whether the claims as structured can move forward at all. And that distinction changes everything, and sets the stage for what comes next. As the case moves deeper into procedural territory, the tension does not fade, it sharpens, because this is the stage where narratives either solidify or quietly unravel. And what makes this phase gripping is that the arguments are no longer about perception, but about process. And courts are unforgiving when process is misused or stretched beyond its limits. And according to the Wayfarer responses, a central issue now is how Blake Lively's legal team has attempted to introduce new material outside the original complaint. And this is where the stakes rise, because when a motion challenges the sufficiency of pleadings, the court is restricted to what was actually filed, not what a party later wishes they had included. And this rule exists to preserve fairness, predictability, and structure. And when a party tries to expand the record midstream, it signals vulnerability rather than strength.
And the defense has pointed this out directly, arguing that if additional claims or facts were necessary, they should have been formally amended months earlier. And this is not technical nitpicking. It is foundational to how civil litigation functions, and judges take this seriously because allowing parties to reshape cases on the fly undermines the integrity of the process. And what keeps viewers leaning forward is the realization that this case may not hinge on credibility debates, but on whether the claims were properly constructed from the start. And that realization reframes everything, because it means that even compelling narratives can fail if they do not align with procedural rules. And that is a lesson Hollywood often forgets, because image-driven industries are used to rewriting stories in post-production, but courts do not allow reshoots. And this rigidity is now colliding with a strategy that appears to rely heavily on narrative expansion rather than structural precision. And as this tension plays out, another layer emerges involving expert testimony and crisis communication analysis, because the defense has introduced an experienced industry expert to contextualize the public response to allegations and argue that actions taken were consistent with standard reputational defense rather than retaliatory conduct. And this matters because it reframes public statements not as aggression but as containment. And courts often rely on expert context to understand industry norms, especially in entertainment, where publicity response is part of the business. And when an expert with decades of experience frames conduct as conventional rather than malicious, it weakens claims that hinge on intent and coordination. And again, this does not decide the case, but it narrows its scope. And narrowing scope is often how cases lose momentum, and momentum loss is visible not just in court, but in how industries respond, because Hollywood pays attention to probability, not passion, and when probability becomes uncertain, distancing begins. And this distancing has been subtle but noticeable in delayed announcements, reduced public alignment, and an overall cooling of association. And none of this requires conspiracy, because risk management is not personal, it is algorithmic, and when a variable introduces volatility, systems adjust. And what keeps audiences engaged is watching that adjustment happen in real time, because it reveals how fame functions when stripped of narrative protection. And this becomes even more pronounced when sealed filings enter the discussion, because sealing always raises questions, not accusations, but questions. And while courts allow sealing for legitimate privacy and safety reasons, the volume and breadth of sealed material becomes part of the conversation, especially when public claims rely on transparency as a moral anchor. And when testimony, declarations, and supporting statements are restricted, it creates a paradox where audiences are asked to trust without access. And trust without access is fragile in the digital age. And this fragility fuels speculation, which in turn fuels attention. And the story sustains itself not through scandal, but through unresolved contradiction. And as viewers follow each filing, they begin to notice that much of the submitted material appears indirect, involving conversations, contexts, or individuals not central to the claims. And courts weigh this carefully, because relevance is not about volume, it is about connection. And when evidence requires extensive explanation to justify its inclusion, judges grow skeptical. And skepticism shapes rulings quietly through narrowed consideration and limited admissibility. And this process is slow, methodical, and invisible to most viewers, yet it is where outcomes are often decided. And what heightens suspense is that this methodical pace contrasts sharply with the urgency of public narratives, creating a disconnect that leaves audiences constantly recalibrating expectations. And then the story expands beyond the original parties into questions about commentary, speech, and media classification, because when independent creators are referenced or challenged within litigation, it introduces broader implications about who is protected under journalistic standards and who is not. And recent rulings on these classifications have sparked debate, not because they determine truth, but because they determine vulnerability, and vulnerability affects behavior. And when creators feel exposed, commentary shifts. And when commentary shifts, narratives narrow, and that narrowing itself becomes part of the story.
because it highlights power dynamics between institutions and individuals, and this is where the case transcends celebrity and becomes symbolic of a larger media moment where boundaries between reporting, commentary, and analysis are being tested in courtrooms rather than newsrooms. And audiences sense the weight of that shift because it affects how stories like this will be discussed in the future and whether independent voices will feel secure challenging dominant narratives. And this sense of consequence keeps viewers watching because it is no longer just about one lawsuit. It is about precedent, and precedent shapes landscapes long after individual cases resolve. And as all of these threads intertwine, procedural challenges, expert testimony, sealed filings, industry response, and media implications, the picture becomes increasingly complex, and complexity sustains attention because simple stories end quickly, while complex ones invite continued observation. And at this stage, the case has not delivered a climax. It has delivered uncertainty. And uncertainty is the most powerful retention tool because it keeps audiences returning, searching for signals and interpreting silence. And in Hollywood and in court, silence is rarely empty. It is often the sound of decisions being made. What makes this moment significant is not any single allegation or filing, but the broader pattern now visible to anyone paying attention. This case has moved beyond headlines and emotional framing into the realm where structure, evidence, and procedure decide outcomes. Courts do not respond to popularity or outrage. They respond to jurisdiction, definitions, relevance, and timing. And as those elements are examined more closely, the gap between narrative and legal viability becomes harder to ignore. That gap is where influence quietly fades and where industries recalibrate without announcements or press releases. Hollywood does not exile people publicly. It pauses, it delays, it distances. And those signals are already present, not as punishment, but as risk management. When uncertainty grows, investment hesitates. When hesitation spreads, momentum slows. That process is not personal and it is not dramatic. It is simply how the system protects itself. The same is true in courtrooms, where judges narrow issues, limit scope, and focus only on what the law allows, not what public opinion prefers. This story also raises larger questions about speech, media, and who gets protection in an evolving digital landscape. As creators, commentators, and analysts become part of legal conversations, the boundaries between influence and accountability are being tested in real time. Those outcomes will matter long after this case resolves because they will shape how stories are told, challenged, and discussed going forward. No verdict has been reached and no final ruling has been issued, but one thing is already clear. This is no longer a story driven by image control. It is driven by documents, decisions, and process. And once a narrative enters that phase, control shifts away from public relations and into institutions that do not bend for reputation. That is why people are still watching, not for spectacle, but to see how power behaves when it meets limits.